My parents stole my 4-year-old while I worked a 16-hour shift, called me a filthy failure, told my ex I was too poor to love her. Now they're homeless, starving, and begging me to forgive them after my dad collapsed from a heart attack. I still remember the sound my apartment door made that night. Not kicked in, not broken. Just open. Like whoever had been there didn't think they'd done anything wrong. It was November, cold, wet, and I'd just finished a 16-hour shift at the warehouse because holiday overtime meant the difference between groceries and debt. I dragged myself up the stairs, dead on my feet, and when I saw that door hanging half open, I thought maybe I'd been robbed. My first instinct was panic. My daughter Nora was supposed to be asleep inside. She wasn't. Her little unicorn backpack was gone, her blanket, her stuffed rabbit Clover that she never slept without, everything gone. The apartment felt wrong. Too clean, too still. And then I saw it. The envelope sitting on the counter with my name typed neatly across the front. It was from my parents. I remember my hands shaking so hard I could barely open it. Inside was a letter, printed in perfect margins, signed by my mother, Clara. It said they'd taken Nora to where she truly belonged, with her mother, Haley. That they couldn't stand by and watch their granddaughter grow up in squalor and emotional instability. That I was a man wasting his life pushing pallets in a warehouse, and that real fathers don't let their children sleep beside cockroaches. They'd actually written that. I called Haley immediately. She picked up on the first ring, didn't even sound surprised. She said Nora was already asleep in her real home, that my parents had opened her eyes to how unstable I was, that she'd already spoken to her lawyer about emergency custody. She said it so casually, like my entire world wasn't disintegrating on the other end of the call. I called my dad next. Howard. He answered on the second ring, smug as hell. Told me this was a wake-up call. That I was 31, working a job with no future, renting a shoebox apartment infested with pests, still wearing the same steel-toe boots I'd bought 3 years ago. Said Nora deserved better. Said Haley's new husband, some sales guy named Chad, could provide the kind of life I never would. Then my mother took the phone and actually laughed. Told me maybe this would finally motivate me to stop settling for mediocrity. I sat there, in that freezing apartment, surrounded by silence that used to sound like home, and I couldn't even cry. Just numb. I don't think I blinked for a full minute. Then I grabbed my laptop and started searching. Parental kidnapping laws, emergency custody order, grandparents' rights, custody interference. By sunrise, I'd read every single legal term like it was gospel. At 9 a.m., I called in sick and drove straight to the courthouse. Filed a police report. Filed an emergency motion. Called a lawyer I couldn't afford but hired anyway. He told me it would be complicated. That since they'd taken Nora to her legal mother, the criminal side would be murky. But the custody interference? Ironclad. Haley filed her own motion that same day. Claimed I was mentally unstable due to financial stress, asked for supervised visits only. Attached statements from my parents describing me as a barely functioning single father. They said I was a danger to myself and to Nora. And in that moment, sitting in a courthouse waiting room with paperwork trembling in my hands, I realized something dark and final. My parents hadn't just betrayed me. They'd planned this. Everything about it, the letter, the timing, even the words they used. It wasn't panic or poor judgment. It was strategy. And the worst part? They thought they'd win. They thought they'd finally proven that their son was a failure. They had no idea what kind of man they'd just created. To really understand how it got to that point, you have to know what my family's like. On paper, we look normal. Howard and Clara Jensen, middle-class couple from Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was a plant manager at an auto parts company for 30 years. She taught 4th grade. They're the kind of people who think a person's worth can be measured by the square footage of their house and the brand of their car. I was their only kid. They expected me to be an engineer, a real man with a career. Instead, I worked my way up from forklift operator to warehouse supervisor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and it kept my daughter fed. That didn't matter to them. To them, I was wasting potential. Manual labor, my mom used to say, like the words tasted sour in her mouth. They adored my ex, Haley. She came from money, old money, the kind that talks about summers in Cape Cod and holiday photos in Aspen. Her parents gave us a down payment for our first apartment, paid for our wedding, even bought our first car. My parents worshipped her. When we got married, my mom told me, "You really lucked out, David. Try not to screw it up." And yeah, I did screw it up, but not in the way they thought. Haley wanted luxury, not a life. She wanted dinners at nice places, vacations, spa days. She wanted to be envied. I wanted to be a dad. We were doomed from the start. The fights started over small things, money, work hours, the baby crying at night. Then they turned into constant wars. Every night was another round of, "You're holding me back." When Nora was born, everything got worse. I thought becoming a mom would change Haley. It didn't. She treated Nora like a prop for Instagram photos. I did the feedings, the diaper changes, the 2 a.m. rocking sessions while she posted pictures of family bliss. By the time Nora was 2, Haley was done pretending. She moved out, filed for divorce, and within 6 months she was dating Chad, the pharmaceutical rep who could afford her favorite restaurants. The divorce settlement gave me joint custody. Nora stayed with me every other week. It wasn't ideal, but it worked, for a while. Then Haley started hinting that my studio apartment wasn't good for a growing child. That Nora needed stability. My parents took her side immediately. I'll never forget that first dinner when my dad said, "You should let Haley take full custody. It's not fair to keep Nora in that dump every other week." That's when I realized they didn't see me as Nora's father anymore. Just some temporary inconvenience between their granddaughter and the perfect family they wanted her to have. After that, things got colder. My parents stopped visiting unless Nora was there. They criticized everything about my life: the apartment, my car, my clothes. One night my mom actually asked if I was depressed enough to be dangerous. I thought it was a cruel joke at the time. Now I know she was setting up the story she'd tell in court later. When Haley remarried, they were thrilled. They called Chad their son-in-law like I'd never existed. And when Nora spent time at their house, they'd talk about Haley's beautiful home and what a good man Chad was. Subtle poison. Little by little, they were reprogramming my daughter to believe her mom's life was the only version of normal. I knew they didn't respect me, but I never thought they'd cross the line. I thought, deep down, they still loved me enough to never touch the one thing that mattered most. Turns out I was wrong. They didn't just take Nora, they stole my identity as a father. And they did it with the same calm precision my mom used to grade papers. After that night, everything turned into a blur of court dates, legal filings, and sleepless nights. I'd go to work, put on my steel-toe boots, load trucks all day, then come home and spend hours drafting statements, answering my lawyer's emails, and crying quietly in the bathroom so my neighbors wouldn't hear. Haley was ruthless. She had Chad's money and her lawyer's charm on her side. Her filings painted me as financially unstable and emotionally volatile. My parents backed up every word. They signed affidavits claiming my apartment was unsanitary and that Nora often appeared anxious in her father's care. Lies, all of it. The cops didn't arrest them. My lawyer explained why technically, since Haley was Nora's legal guardian too, my parents hadn't kidnapped her in the criminal sense. It was called custodial interference. Basically, a polite way of saying they'd screwed me over in a way that wouldn't land them in handcuffs. Every night I replayed that letter in my head, the way it said, "You've had your chance, David. It's time to let someone else do right by Nora." I wanted to burn it. Instead, I kept it in a drawer. Proof. Haley's side thought I'd break. They figured I'd crumble under the legal pressure. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I'd been preparing for this since the day Haley started dropping hints about custody. See, 3 years earlier, when she began making those little comments about stability and better homes, I'd started saving. Every overtime shift, every side gig, every tax refund, I hoarded it. I lived cheap, ate ramen, skipped nights out. My studio apartment wasn't a sign of failure. It was part of the plan. I was quietly building a war chest for exactly this kind of fight. And I needed it, because Haley's attorney moved fast. Within 2 weeks, I was facing hearings about emergency custody and mental health evaluations. I passed every evaluation. Passed the surprise home visit too. The inspector saw the cockroach traps and noted I was actively resolving the issue. My lawyer told me that detail probably saved me. When I saw my parents in court for the first time, I barely recognized them. Not because they looked different, but because they looked smug. My dad wore a navy blazer he hadn't touched since retirement, sitting there like a man convinced justice was on his side. My mom smiled when the judge entered, like this was a school assembly. When it was my turn to speak, I could feel them watching. My father's eyes, cold, judgmental. My mother's calculated, waiting for me to stumble. But I didn't. I told the judge everything: the letter, the phone calls, the manipulation. I showed texts from Haley threatening to revisit custody if I couldn't provide a stable home. 8 months. That's how long it took. 8 months of legal hell. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. He called my parents' testimony biased and malicious. He said there was no evidence that I was unfit. He reinstated the original custody order with some added conditions that worked in my favor. Haley's face when the ruling came down, pure fury. My parents looked like they'd been slapped. After court, they actually showed up at my apartment. My mom held a casserole dish, like that would erase everything. Said they only wanted what was best for Nora. My dad said, family should forgive family. I told them to leave before I called the cops. That night, I sat on my couch staring at the same wall where their letter had been. I should have felt relief, but what I felt was colder. Sharper. They'd tried to take my child. They'd humiliated me, lied under oath, laughed while they did it. Forgiveness wasn't coming. No, something else was, and I wasn't going to rush it. 2 weeks after the court ruling, just when I thought it was over, I found out something that nearly made me sick. It started with a call from my old buddy, Luke, who worked in banking. We hadn't talked in a while, but he sounded weirdly cautious on the phone. He asked if I was still listed as a financial reference for my parents. I said, "What are you talking about?" He told me my name and contact info were on a mortgage refinance application from 5 years ago, the same year Haley and I divorced. I didn't remember agreeing to that. Luke sent me a copy of the file. Sure enough, there it was: David Jensen, verified employment and character reference. My parents had signed my name electronically. They'd used me to vouch for their income, their stability, their creditworthiness. They'd used my reputation to help them pull out nearly $90,000 in equity from their house. And here's the part that burned most. They'd done that while telling everyone I was a financial disaster who couldn't provide for his kid. I sat in my car outside work just staring at that document. It was like the world had tilted. All those years of their lectures about responsibility and being a provider, and they'd literally forged my name to bankroll their retirement dreams. When I confronted them, my dad didn't deny it. He said, "It was just paperwork, David. You'd have done it if we asked." My mom said, "We didn't think you'd mind." I almost lost it. That's when I realized the kidnapping hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment act of concern. It had been a coordinated effort to erase me. Every lie, every manipulation, every carefully crafted statement, they'd built a narrative over years. The unstable son, the struggling father, the man who couldn't handle responsibility. It made sense now. If they could convince everyone I was unfit, nobody would question why they'd stepped in. They'd already set the stage. And the more I thought about it, the darker it got. Because what if Haley had known the whole time? I checked through old emails, old messages. There it was, a thread from months before the kidnapping. Haley had written, "I've been talking to your parents about long-term stability for Nora. We all just want what's best." My parents replied, "We agree completely. We'll do what's necessary when the time comes." When the time comes. That phrase echoed in my head like a gunshot. They'd planned this with her. Maybe not down to the exact night, but the intent had been there. They'd built a quiet conspiracy to take my daughter and destroy my credibility in the process. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was premeditated. And once you realize people you love are capable of something like that, it changes something in you permanently. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying their words in court, how polished they'd sounded, how rehearsed. My mother crying on cue, my father emphasizing mental instability, just enough to make the judge doubt me for a second. I realized I'd been fighting a war I didn't even know existed, and I'd only won the first battle. So I started thinking differently, strategically. They thought I'd move on, rebuild my life, forget about it, but I wasn't that naive anymore. Forgiveness was off the table. What I wanted was something cleaner, slower. I wanted them to feel what I'd felt, the helplessness, the humiliation, the fear of losing everything. And I already had the tools to make that happen. Because before all of this went down, I was the one who'd helped my dad set up his retirement accounts. He'd trusted me completely with the logins, the backups, the paperwork. The access was still there. They'd used my name to build their comfort. Now I was going to use theirs to dismantle it. I didn't do anything right away. That's what people never understand about revenge. It's not rage, it's patience. I spent almost 6 months just watching, gathering, waiting. My parents still had no clue I knew about the forged reference or their messages with Haley. They thought the court ruling had closed the book on the whole thing. They were back to posting pictures of brunches with Haley and Chad, pretending we were one big happy family who just had a custody misunderstanding. I watched from the sidelines while they smiled through their guilt. And I documented everything. The bank refinance, the false testimony, every lie they'd told. I learned the details of their finances because I still had limited access to my dad's retirement portal. He'd given it to me before he retired, told me, "You're better with computers than me. Just keep an eye on this in case I screw it up." I hadn't touched it in years. But when I logged in again, it all came flooding back. His accounts, his contact numbers, his linked addresses. I didn't touch the money. That would have been illegal. What I did do was start making small, almost invisible changes. Slight address mismatches, a single-digit typo in a phone number. Subtle enough that no human would notice, but a computer would flag it. Every time a flag triggered, the account went into fraud review. Every fraud review froze access to funds until verification. Little delays, little inconveniences. I wanted them to feel pressure, not pain. Not yet. Then I started tightening the net. I contacted the bank where they'd refinanced their house anonymously and updated my information as the reference they'd listed. I informed them that the verification had been made under false pretenses. I didn't accuse them of fraud, I just expressed concerns. That one word, concerns, sent the file straight to internal review, and that's how the slow bleed began. Meanwhile, I was rebuilding my own life in silence. I took every shift I could, got promoted to shift lead, then supervisor again. Moved into a better apartment but kept my expenses low. My lawyer was paid off, my debts cleared, and I had money growing in the bank. On the surface, I was just a quiet, hardworking dad rebuilding from a bad few years. But underneath, I was dismantling their comfort piece by piece. By the second year, their minor account issues had turned into full-blown financial chaos. My dad was on the phone with banks weekly, furious about fraud alerts he couldn't resolve. My mom posted vague Facebook updates about hard times and unfair systems. They had no idea the system was me. The heart attack hit about a year later. I heard it through a cousin, mild but expensive. The medical bills stacked fast because their insurance had coverage gaps. And the best part? Their retirement accounts were frozen again over another identity verification issue. I didn't cause his heart attack. But I didn't lose sleep over it either. When their attorney, a guy named Alan, called me last month to beg me to help them, I realized something. I had finally become the monster they'd created. Calm, rational, and entirely focused on balance. Alan said they were living in their car now, that my mom had lost weight from stress, that they'd do anything if I could help them get back on their feet. I almost laughed. 3 years earlier, those same people told me I wasn't fit to raise my daughter, called me a failure, testified that I was mentally unstable. Now they wanted mercy. I didn't give it, but I wasn't done either, because what I discovered next made everything 10 times darker. It started when Alan, their lawyer, called again. His voice cracked halfway through the message. He said, "David, please. There's something you need to know. This isn't just about money anymore." For a second, I thought maybe one of them had died, but it was worse. He told me my parents had lost everything, not just the house, not just the car, but their story, their version of events. And the reason they'd gone so public about being abandoned wasn't just desperation. It was part of something bigger. A few days later, I got an email from an unknown address with the subject line, "You should know what they told people." Attached was a PDF of screenshots, group texts between my mom, Haley, and Chad. The same trio who'd worked together to take Nora from me 3 years earlier. The messages were dated after the court case ended, and what they said made my blood turn cold. Haley had been in constant contact with my parents for years. They hadn't just conspired to take Nora, they'd been actively working to destroy me afterward too. Every anonymous complaint my job received about my anger issues, every fake welfare check from social services that someone requested, every concerned neighbor report, those had been them. The group chat even had jokes. My mom had written, "If David loses this job too, maybe he'll finally hand Nora over permanently." And Haley responded, "He'll never admit he's drowning. Some people need to hit bottom before they learn. Chad, let him drown then, he's dead weight anyway." The last message in the chain was from Haley, dated almost a year ago. "Don't worry. If something happens to him, I'll make sure Nora remembers you both as heroes." That was the moment everything clicked. This wasn't just about proving they were better than me. It was about erasing me completely. The forged documents, the false testimony, the financial sabotage, it had all been groundwork for something much bigger. If I'd cracked under the pressure, lost my job, or God forbid, done something desperate, they would have used it as proof. Haley would have gone back to court claiming I was unstable again. My parents would have testified, again, that they tried to help. They'd built an entire contingency plan around my collapse. I sat in silence for hours reading and rereading those screenshots. My hands were shaking so hard that my phone almost slipped. Every laugh, every smug text, they were proud of what they were doing. They saw it as righteous. And what twisted the knife even deeper? The first contact between Haley and my parents about all this hadn't started after the divorce. It started before. One of the oldest messages was dated 2 months before Haley moved out. It said, "If I leave, can you promise to help me keep Nora stable? David's not going to take it well." My mom's reply, "We'll handle it, you just do what you need to do." They'd been planning to destroy me before the marriage even ended. The kidnapping hadn't been a reaction, it had been the execution of a long, calculated plan. That was the second twist. Not just that my parents had betrayed me, but that they'd done it in partnership with the woman who'd vowed to love me. I didn't cry this time, didn't yell. I just started writing. I printed out every screenshot, every timestamp, every bank record and letter. I organized it all into labeled folders: forgery, perjury, conspiracy. Because I realized something that night: revenge wasn't just about payback anymore. It was about truth. I was done being the quiet one in their story. It was time to make the world see what they'd done, and to make sure it followed them until their last breath. When you finally see the whole shape of somebody's plan, it doesn't feel like a revelation so much as the moment the lights come on in a place you thought you knew. Everything that had felt like petty cruelty snapped into focus, and the picture was worse than anything I'd imagined. At first, I wanted to believe it was simple: status, snobbery, greed. But there's a difference between a person who covets things and a person who erases another human to get them. What I found out turned that anger into a bone-deep cold I still feel when I wake up. The group texts were the door. Those screenshots showed coordination, sure, but then I found the other thing: the file folder buried in an old thumb drive my dad had left at my place when he needed help with emails. It had PDFs, scanned notes, and a single spreadsheet with a header that made me drop the coffee cup. Future Trust/Nora Jensen. They'd been planning a trust for Nora. Not for her protection, not for college. It was a ledger, a calculated projection of how much value Nora would have if she was raised inside Haley's world instead of mine. They'd estimated living costs, income growth with Chad's career, possible inheritances. They'd even penciled in donations and tax advantages. Bottom line: Nora, raised as Haley's child in Chad's zip code, would become a financial instrument. And the cruelest part? My parents had been promised a seat at that table. They hadn't just been bribed with a casserole and smug approval. Haley had offered them a contingency. "Help us remove David. Help us build the narrative that you're the stable grandparents, and we will ensure Nora's trust names you as guardians and beneficiaries should something happen to us. In plain English, play the long game with us and you won't be alone when you're old." That's what it all came down to, not ideology, not "we thought it was best." Survival. Self-preservation dressed as moral outrage. They weren't doing it for Nora. They were doing it for retirement, for being cared for in their old age by people who had social capital and money. They wanted the assurance that someone with a fancy degree and an oceanside summer house would be responsible for their twilight years. They wanted their names in wills. They wanted guarantees. When I read the emails between Haley and my mother, where they specifically talked about ensuring support and legacy placement, I felt like I'd been punched through the chest. They'd weaponized my child to buy themselves a better ending. They'd used my daughter as a bargaining chip to secure a lifestyle I'd never even asked for. They traded my fatherly failures, real or imagined, like currency. There was no moral high ground in any of it. There was cold calculus. They'd rehearsed every line to the courtroom. Concerned grandparents, worried about stability. It was theater designed to manufacture consent. Every pitying phone call, every whispered "he's struggling," was part of a proposal that said, remove his rights, increase your stake. That's the thing about betrayals. You can survive the slap, but it's the quiet accounting that ruins you. Knowing your parents did more than judge you, they schemed to monetarily insure themselves at the expense of your relationship with your child. They monetized your absence. When you realize that, forgiveness isn't an option because it would be tacit assent. I could imagine them sitting together over tea, humming about doing what's necessary, while someone small slept in another room of the house they engineered her into. I'll never unsee that. So yeah, the motive was greed, sure. But it wasn't just money. It was a slow-motion, institutional erasure. Swap out the undesired father for a cleaner lineage, secure the trust, and retire into comfort. Every lie, every forged signature, every late-night text was a small transaction toward that end. That cold, methodical logic is what made them truly monstrous. Not because they wanted money, but because they chose my daughter as the vehicle to get it. I printed every single file, labeled them, dated them, photocopied the chat logs with timestamps. I fed everything to my lawyer and told him to breathe. I told him if we didn't bury them in proof, they'd keep crawling back. I wanted them exposed not just for what they did to me, but for what they'd been willing to do to a child. And I wanted it to hurt. By the time the court dates rolled around again, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns hot and quick, but this was cold, methodical. I'd spent 3 years documenting, collecting, calculating. I had an entire binder labeled Legacy Fraud. Exhibit A, my lawyer filed everything at once. The defamation suit for the false testimony, the evidence of forged documents, and a supplemental motion for financial interference. It wasn't criminal, yet, but it was enough to tie up every last account they had in discovery for months. When the hearing came, they showed up looking like ghosts. My dad's suit hung off him like he'd lost 50 pounds. My mom's hair was gray and stringy. They both looked at me like I was a stranger, and maybe I was. The son they raised had been gone for a long time. Their legal aid attorney tried the sympathy route, told the judge they were elderly, broke, that all of this was just a family misunderstanding blown out of proportion. My lawyer didn't raise his voice once. He just started laying evidence on the table, the forged reference, the chat logs, the trust spreadsheet with projected gains for removal of father as guardian. Every page landed like a hammer. When the emails appeared on the big screen, my mom gasped. She whispered, "Where did you get those?" I didn't answer. I just looked at her the way she'd looked at me that night she called me a failure. The judge's face went hard halfway through the evidence. He said, "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is calculated deceit." The ruling took less than 15 minutes. The court granted the defamation suit, ordered restitution for legal costs, and referred the forgery findings to the district attorney for potential charges. The trust file alone was enough for a fraud investigation. That was it. The plan they'd spent years building collapsed in one afternoon. A month later, their house was gone. The accounts were frozen. Haley stopped answering their calls the moment she realized they were liabilities, not allies. Chad dumped her a few months after that, right around when his company cut him loose for ethics concerns. I didn't have to lift another finger. Everything unraveled on its own. The last time I saw my parents in person was outside the courthouse. My dad looked at me and said, "You're not better than us, David. You're just cruel." I told him, "You taught me." They drove off in their beat-up sedan and never came back. Sometimes, when Nora's asleep, I think about them, about whether I went too far. But then I remember the letter on my counter, the smug phone calls, the plan to erase me from my daughter's life, and the way they laughed about it. Now Nora has her own room in my new apartment. We bake cookies on Sundays. She laughs when I lift her onto my shoulders to change the light bulbs. She tells people, "My daddy fixes everything." And maybe she's right. I fixed the narrative, I fixed my life. They wanted to prove I was a failure. Instead, I proved that consequences have perfect memory. People ask if I'll ever forgive them. I tell them forgiveness is for accidents. What my parents did was a decision. And decisions have outcomes. I sleep fine at night. Because justice doesn't always come from the courts. Sometimes it comes from the person you tried to destroy, and the silence that follows when you finally realize they won.